All right, tight, tight quarters, but we've been spending a lot of time together this week, so and we'll just pass that microphone around as we go. I know, actually, first of all, I think it would be good, and we were going to do this maybe up on the stage, but I think actually having you all together and getting a reaction to Craig Rucker at CFACT and Mark Morano of CFACT. You guys have passes to the conference, so you're really able to get not just close, but in and about. So I wonder if I think our viewers, and I think for posterity, you should perhaps take 5-10 minutes to talk about your experience at the COP 26, and maybe compare it to the other COPs you've been to. Because, in fact, with Moncton in the middle, that is actually perfect because you three are a triumvirate of COP crashing. So go ahead.
Oh my goodness! I was going to say, getting into this conference is, I don't know, it's almost like a prison break in reverse, trying to get in. To be candid with you, I've never been, and I've been to like 28 of these conferences. I've never been to a conference where it's been this difficult and this many hurdles to go through. First of all, coming from the United States, you have to, of course, have your COVID testing to get on the airline. You got to take it in day 2, getting into Scotland, and daily you have to take COVID tests to get into the conference and show that you've had it. Now, that said, it's kind of a little bit goofy because these COVID tests on a daily basis are actually something that are voluntary. I mean, you take the test, but it's kind of your honor system if you report it as positive or negative. They're not actually checking. They just want to see that when you give in your result, they ask you, did you get a positive test or negative? You say negative. They send you a little text message, which you have to go in addition to the badges, in order to have access to the conference. Once you get in, the seating is, social distancing. They have mask requirements, all of which are flaunted in a big deal, which is kind of, I guess, somewhat encouraging. But you see the delegates running around, no social distancing. The seats that even are sanctioned off, where they have these little ropes and things on there to make sure that people don't sit too close to each other. People are sitting on top of them or just taking them away. And so, and interestingly too, these COVID tests that they give you are in boxes made from China. Very placed from the Wuhan lab and everything. So the very people who are credited with possibly starting this are the ones profiting from this UN conference, and it's their COVID tests that they're taking. So, long lines, freezing cold too. You're sitting outside, especially the first couple days, waiting, and a gore effect was in full effect here, and it was a real mess. So I think once you were able to do all those hurdles, you were able to get in less painfully the second and third and fourth day, but you still had to show that, you took the COVID test, and they still, do that. That said, I think the delegates right now are just, I think it's great once you get in, but because of all these particular obstacles, there's not as much zaniness going on, because I think there just isn't a lot of people able to get in that are the crazy types.
Right.
And they've also put them in what's called, you have a blue zone and a green zone at these conferences. The blue zone is for the official delegates. We have access to that, but you also have a green zone. And they park the green zone people so far outside of where the regular delegates are that they're so comfortably away that whatever they're doing, we just send somebody out there to go cover it now, and I'm not sure he found it yet. It's that difficult to find. You want to add any of this, Mark?
I think Craig talked about this earlier, but our staff, we ran into Al Gore. Craig got to ask him about his carbon footprint. We've seen Jeff Bezos there. Greta has come and gone. She's mostly outside. I don't think she has an official speaking role at this conference, but she has been in doing interviews and talking to people. Leonardo DiCaprio arrived yesterday, Bill Gates. Ooh. So it's all the usual suspects. I'm not sure if Harrison Ford is here. But as Craig said, this is logistically just not a great center compared to previous ones. Usually you could go from an NGO center and a green zone back and forth and get a whole sense. This is just, because especially the COVID protocols and the geographical layout, it's just a processing nightmare of a convention. But as we said earlier, I don't think it's any problem. No wonder Joe Biden fell asleep. Nothing's really happening at this. And I think most interestingly, one of the things they've come out with today, when the United States is pushing, is the methane requirements. And I think they're pushing this. The whole idea is the United States going to Biden administration. We're going to be aggressive, and that way we'll lead the way for Russia, China, the developing world side. Everyone's going to follow our lead. Well, besides the fact that methane is dubbed the irrelevant greenhouse gas, it's an important one for the Biden administration and the climate agenda, because this is the first step, and they're laying the groundwork here to go after meat eating. They're going to make meat as expensive as possible. We already have the UN summits talking about pushing the fake meat, vegetable processed burger, and also they're going to be pushing insect eating. So they're trying to make meat as expensive and hard to reach as SUVs, and gas is what they're trying to do with vehicles. So this is just, it's bad. It's beyond virtue signaling. They're not going to change the climate. They're not going to even stop CO2 emissions, but they're going to harm millions of people's lives.
Although they do sell burgers in this joint here, so though they want everybody else to do without meat, you can buy a full meat pack at any of these conference meetings.
And I just wanted to just get a quick, actually, observation on when we were together at COP. Was it 21 in Paris? Was it COP? It was the COP in Paris. I believe that was. That's right. I believe it was 20. That was the most important COP. That was the COP that would save the world. I remember the attitude of the delegates and the media was triumphant. They were elated that we were finally going to save the world. And it seems to me that this COP, the attitude is, oh crap, we didn't save the world, and now we have to do it again. But to me, it seems the mood, at least the way reflected in the media, is glum. I mean, the weather actually here in Scotland has been fantastic, but the mood, the attitude has been glum. Am I wrong? And
well, I was going to say,
compare that to Paris.
Good point, Jim. It is a little more glum in what you would expect, but there is something that's interesting going on too, is that I find that we went to a meeting yesterday of the WMO, World Meteorological Organization, which is one of the groups that's founded this whole UN process. And very sterile audience, in terms of how they were receiving reports from all the different continents about how bad weather is. One of our delegates came up and said, but CO2 is also leading to record, corn yields, wheat yields, a greening of the earth. It was not met with the usual hostility. We were a little bit disappointed, I guess, in some regard. We expected to be fired at or something like that. But it was handled by one African member of it who said, no, CO2 is only causing drought, scorching earth, and, Armageddon in Africa. There is no positive benefits to it. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But no hostility, which is kind of almost unsettling. It seems like they've lost a little bit of their, oomph at this conference. And I think people are actually getting accustomed to coming to these very nice cities, and their priority is maybe going to see some of the castles or something. I'm not really sure how intense they are on all what's going on.
If they're not out while the weather's been great, they're not going to come out when it starts raining next week. But Lord Monckton?
Yeah, one quick point on this business of doing away with meat. What you notice at each of these successive conferences is that they find a new Western industry that they can dismantle and destroy. They're not going to stop eating meat in China or Russia or India, but they're going to make sure that we stop eating meat. Now, the danger, if we go down that road, is of killing large numbers of people through diabetes and obesity. The pandemic of diabetes and obesity, which is now worldwide, is going to be one of the biggest killers in the world, even if we don't ban meat. But if you do ban meat, then people will be forced onto a high carbohydrate diet, and it's that which causes diabetes, it causes obesity, it causes metabolic syndrome, it causes a whole range of diseases, including heart attacks. The original research on heart attacks in the United States was incorrect. It suggested that eating fat caused heart attacks. It doesn't. Excuse me. It's the eating of carbohydrate that causes heart attacks by causing lesions in the arterial walls. Fat is then taken from the bloodstream to paste over those walls. If you go on eating carbohydrates, then the arteries become occluded with fat, but it's because you've eaten carbohydrates, not fat, that happens. So now that the left are moving towards abolishing the eating of meat, they're not only trying to destroy half of the Western agricultural enterprise, they're also trying to destroy the Western population by getting it onto high carbohydrate, which is an extremely dangerous way of life. And these medical consequences of their proposals need to be fully understood.
One question for you, though, is that they'll argue they're pushing insect eating as a great
Speak in the
source
microphone.
of protein. They're pushing insect eating as a great source of protein. That's their solution. So how, instead of going high carb, how do you answer that?
Well, good luck with that. I don't think it's going to get very far, frankly.
There isn't enough spice in the world.
Exactly. I think that it shows how much they're trying to bring the West down to third world status. That's what this is really all about. It's got nothing whatever to do with the climate. Whether we eat insects or don't eat insects, it simply doesn't affect the climate, nor does it affect the climate if we eat meat. Remember how often the wretched environmentalists simply get the science flat out wrong, time and time again. Every time you hear an environmentalist making a scientific pronouncement, it's almost certainly incorrect. Only a few years ago, they decided that the savanna, the grass in Africa, was coming to harm because of elephants trampling it. So the environmentalists decided the best thing to do was to slaughter 40,000 African elephants. Only then did somebody like us get up and say, hang on a moment, the trampling of the grass is a natural process. It's been going on for tens of millions of years. That's what makes the grass spread and grow and be strong. And so then the environmentalists had to issue an apology for having slaughtered more elephants over that period than the various illegal hunters had done. So it is time that we say to the so-called environmental movement, that part of it which is genuinely environmental, rather than agencies of some foreign powers wishing to do the West harm, from now on, you get the science right, or we're going to start prosecuting you for fraud, because we're no longer prepared to tolerate the drivel that comes out at these conferences.
Very good, very good. Okay, so we have some questions from our viewers on the live stream here, and I have some for myself, so we'll see how many we can get through in the time that we have remaining. And I think, Harry, this might be a good one for you. The General says, the biggest threat to us is the spreading of propaganda by the BBC and other channels. What can the Heartland Institute and others, and the other groups that we're affiliated with, can do to influence this?
Thank you. Yes, I think part of that approach has been in the build-up to this conference. We were hearing about how it's maybe quite more demure than usual, and I think that's been deliberate because Alok Sharma, who's the UK minister who's in charge of leading this conference, has actually got quite angry with the Prime Minister for raising expectations too high. So there was a conscious effort then to lower expectations because they were worried it wouldn't be able to deliver. And so we've seen a lot of rather negative portrayals in the media. So what can we do? We've just got to be here and keep presenting what the actual science is saying about climate change. We've got to make the arguments that fossil fuels have actually improved the world quite enormously. And we've got to remind people that there are benefits to fossil fuels as well as disadvantages. That may seem simple to you and me, but actually with the propaganda that people are listening to, they're not necessarily hearing that point. So we've got to keep emphasizing those benefits and talk about the costs as well of transitioning to other fuels. Because yes, a free market society can actually adapt very quickly when new technologies compete in the marketplace to replace technologies. So we could see a very fast transition if it's a market-based approach. However, a government socialist approach in which the government picks winners is the worst possible way. It's going to cost people an awful lot of money, and it actually won't deliver a particularly speedy transition either.
Well, but I think the question is, how do you break through? I mean, I watched television for exactly 7 minutes yesterday, and it was the end of a BBC Scotland presentation. They had a roundtable. It was debate night, is what it was called. And they had, I believe, 5 people on a panel, all very well socially distanced, no worries. And they went around, and I thought when I first turned it on, I heard somebody who was like on our side, right, a climate realist type person on BBC. because he was complaining about the hypocrisy of the local airport accepting 400 private planes and parking them around like a valet parking lot. I mean, there were so many, they had to make exceptions to get them all in there. And this guy was upset about the hypocrisy of that. I'm like, oh, wow, so they actually have a climate realist on there. And then in the next 5 minutes I watched, and he was included, every single person on that panel says that now is the time we must act. This is, I mean, the same garbage we heard in Paris in 2015. But all of them were climate alarmists. All of them believe that the humans are causing a climate crisis. And all of them believe that no matter what the cost, we must do something, and we must do something now. And the Glasgow COP will be known as the one in which we save the world, which, again, we've been hearing for 20 years. And so I think the question is, you should have been invited on that panel to at least offer 1 out of 5 of somebody who's at least somewhat reasonable, let alone, as far as a realist as you are. Why can't... You watch more BBC than me because I don't watch any, so because I don't live here. But you don't see your side represented anywhere in the media. But how do you fix that, right?
And that's been going on a very long time, is that the BBC have actually said they don't want to hear from skeptics. They actually have a document which instructs their employees not to have any discussions of these topics, not to have that balance, because they say that would be a false balance. But I think our best weapon is actually the hypocrisy of world leaders. It's the fact that they're coming here with hundreds of private jets in chauffeur-driven cars, and the public can see that. They can see the hypocrisy. They can see the absurdity of all these bigwigs pretending they're going to save the planet. It's not clear they even believe what they're saying. Do they actually think the world needs saving? I would question that. This is about an ego trip for them. And the public can see that, and so we will keep making that argument. Hopefully we'll get on the BBC one day. We'll keep pursuing those avenues, and hopefully one day we might be represented there as well. But there's new emerging media, there's GB News, there's Talk Radio here in the UK, and they are providing a platform for different views that the BBC and the established media aren't doing. Okay,
very good. James Taylor, I think this one is well suited for you. Cabot001 asks, are you sure that the teachers to whom you send Climate at a Glance won't just bin it if they are climate alarmists? And so I know that happened. In fact, some people took, very good, Craig, thank you. Checks in the mail for holding that up. But we had, some people actually took pictures of a book with a match under it, showing that they were going to burn it, which I hope they do this time around too, because that's great publicity. But what about that concern? I mean, James, if people help us to do this distribution, which is very, very important, how many are going to end up in the bin?
I have the solution: flame retardant. Put all your reports with fire retardant.
Yeah, so some teachers are going to do that, and that's built into the equation. If a certain number are going to throw them out and not show them, even if a majority decide not to present the material and show it to the students, some will. Some will. And we will break through that wall of separation between truth and students that currently exists. If this were 30, 40 years ago, the previous question about how do you break through with the media and the one-sided coverage, if this were 30, 40 years ago, we'd have no hope. We just had 3 network, ABC, CBS, NBC, and then a few national newspapers or other publications, Time or Newsweek, and that's it. But today we have ways to break through. We have social media. We have the internet. We have our climaterealism.com, climateataglance.com. There's climatedepot.com. All sorts. Anthony Watts, whatsupwiththat.com. Tony Heller has a fantastic website. And this is this Climate at a Glance for teachers and students is another way to break through that wall. It's an uphill battle, but we need to utilize every weapon we have. And even if no weapon is going to have 100% exposure, we're going to reach a lot of people. And cumulatively, that's how we win this battle. But I do appreciate the question because it's something we talk about. Well, what's the best use of our resources? How are we most effectively going to get the message out? But in today's world, students, young people, they're only getting one message. And even if we don't reach all of them, we're going to reach a lot of them. And I think it'll make a big difference.
Yeah. I mean, last time we did a mailing like this, we had, like I said, we had the media go crazy that the Heartland Institute was sending this to teachers unsolicited. And so, they get worried about it, which is kind of half the point. But it's because if it's not for, if we don't send this kind of stuff to public schools, they don't get anything like this. It's just not, the research, or the textbooks, I should say, are not remotely balanced.
Yes, and just to follow up also, if you have a student in public schools, especially if you have a high school student, of course that student is going to take science, you can also call attention to your school board, to your principal. You can call attention in the media to the fact that the information is there. Why aren't they presenting it?
Yeah.
And just the knowledge that it's out there will allow students to know where to go and might pressure some school boards to show some balance.
Yeah. Okay, I want to stick with some of the questions of our viewers who've been stuck with us for 2 days, which has been fantastic. Interesting one. I've never heard this one asked before, but I've always wondered it myself. Do the panelists accept that CO2 saturation is nearly achieved?
Shall I stop it?
I knew you would start.
The answer is no, it isn't nearly achieved. The more CO2 you add, the more of a warming effect you can, in theory, get. But the relationship is logarithmic.
Right.
And that means each additional molecule of CO2 that we return to the atmosphere from which it originally came in the first place has less effect in warming the planet than any previous molecule. And that means that it's not so much that we're nearing saturation as that the efficacy of each new molecule in causing warming is less than that of the ones that went before. But the real problem is not so much the direct warming effect of CO2 as the knock-on additional warming caused by what they call feedback. And that means water vapor accumulates in the atmosphere as it gets warmer, and water vapor is a greenhouse gas. But they thought that that feedback effect would be 4 times as large as it actually is, because they made an elementary error of physics in 1984, which they've all copied ever since. So no, CO2 isn't near saturation, but it isn't going to cause very much warming.
Yeah. In fact, Mike Heath had a follow-up question. Can any alarmist change their mind by confirming Lord Monckton's maths? Which I suppose you kind of got into right there. But you've written or co-written academic papers with the likes of Willie Soon and Matt Briggs and others, Ronan Connolly, and that. You've been published in the scientific literature. I think they lean on you for the math for a lot of that stuff. But what has been the reaction to that? Because I think it's either right or wrong. Mathematics tends to be that way. Do climate alarmist scientists who believe this stuff, have they ever confronted your math and proven you wrong?
They keep trying, but unfortunately they just don't know enough control theory, which is the theory of how feedback operates, to realize just how big their mistake has been. So when we submitted our paper on this to a leading journal, we did this 10 months ago, in fact 11 months ago now, and we chose deliberately a journal whose editor had said publicly that, as a true believer in the new superstition of global warming, he did not think that there was any sound skeptical argument against the Climate Communist Party line, shall we call it. And so we thought, well, we'll send it to him, because if there's anything wrong with it, he's sure to be anxious to find it. So what he did on seeing it was to try to derail it with various minor things, like we hadn't submitted it on the right form and that kind of thing. Eventually we complied with all his absurd requirements. And then for 11 months, nothing. I think it's pretty clear they are unable to refute our argument, but they are certainly not willing to publish it.
Fair enough. Thanks for the answer to that question. And CM at the Freckle, one of our commenters, says, we need more Christopher Monckton memes out there, so we'll work on that. I'm sure actually the king of memes around here is CFAX, so maybe they could work on that for you. All right, so let me get some of my observations and questions I had the last couple of days that I was dying to ask you fellas. China obviously famously didn't come to this COP26, which is supposedly the latest and the most important climate conference ever, and we finally have to get something done and all of that. It's been this way. It's been that way for decades. But that's going to be the most important. Russia didn't come either, right? And India said, yeah, we're going to put off those climate emission goals until 2070, if then, because literally the day they made that announcement, the net zero by 2070 announcement, India's ministers asked its coal sector to produce more coal and expedite ongoing fossil fuel projects on the very same day that their prime minister said, we're going to do the net zero by 2070 goal. So, so some reaction to that maybe. It tends to tell me that this is not serious. Well, it's never really been serious, but these people are not. They're trying to fool the hoi polloi, the ordinary person, to make them think they're actually doing something. That's probably the best case scenario. But what is the point of all of this? If the biggest actual polluters, not CO2, but actual polluters of the earth, are not even here to talk, even to tell them in person, sawed off, I'm doing my own thing, which is what India basically did.
Yeah, well, the Indian environmental minister years ago said we are not going to sign on to a United Nations development limiting treaty on climate when up to 40% of their residents live essentially in defined poverty, without running water, electricity, without modern essentials. India knows better. The reason Russia's not here, the reason China's leaders aren't here, very simple. Joe Biden is doing their work. Why would they want to come distract from the good work that Joe Biden is doing for them? John Kerry says climate is the greatest national security threat. It's the Biden policy that's the greatest national security threat. They wouldn't even give Biden the courtesy of a face-to-face meet, China. They wouldn't give John Kerry the courtesy. Of course, they gave that courtesy to the Taliban. China is beside itself loving this week with Joe Biden upping the U.S. commitments. And we also have, Vladimir Putin loving this as, more and more Europe's becoming dependent on Russian oil as they shut down their domestic energy. So this is and also, of course, Saudi Arabia is not here, which means OPEC is very happy as Biden administration is begging them. This is a farce from top to bottom. The Biden administration, I'll tell you the key thing that happened today. It's happening today. Biden, the reports are coming out that he's a down Biden today, not very excited. He's coming home to an America that's transformed. I live in Virginia. What happened in Virginia yesterday with the election night is a huge blow to the COVID mandates and the climate mandates. Virginia was about to do a clean power plan. They were going to start clearing forests for solar panels, renewable energy. It was going to be a huge mess, turning Virginia following the way of the Pennsylvania, of New York, Massachusetts, the regional greenhouse, all of that. That all ends immediately. This is a blow to the technocratic, unelected bureaucrats controlling every aspect. And the Democrats know it. The messaging they have is off. And that's the real message of this climate. Biden overstepped it, and he got spanked for doing it. And that's the election in Virginia and possibly in New Jersey. We'll see what happens.
Just wanted to add that what I found interesting, I was at a working group just 2 days ago. I think it was on Monday. And there aren't very many things going on at the COP because when all the world leaders came, they basically shut down most of the side events, any demonstrations or things. But you could go to a couple of them. They were very boring. In some ways, I kind of identify with Joe Biden falling asleep, and I don't hold that against him. But one of them was dealing with this whole idea of different emission levels for different countries and justifying the idea that basically we got to understand India, China, but even more so the other developing nations, maybe not making as many cuts as the advanced nations because, of course, the advanced nations are the ones who've wreaked havoc on the earth. They've benefited from it economically. And it was amazing to me how many studies they did. They did several of them that they put forward at the conference, basically trying to give academic cover to the idea that we should allow the world can still reach net zero if we allow the developing countries to maybe put out a little bit more, as long as we really hammer it here in the West. So I found that kind of curious. And, you also have the Economist magazine coming out this week, what they call, it's not just a matter of being net zero, it's negative emissions growth.
Right.
And I found that rather curious, too. So the debate coming up right now is how can we basically suck up more CO2 in the West than we, not just that we put out, but what also the developing world puts out. So there's not a lot of pressure on India, China, and these other countries to try to cut back, at least that I'm hearing at this conference.
2070 is a long way off.
Just to do the figures on this, because it's quite important when you get these pietistic ideas coming out. But the fact is that 70% of all new emissions of CO2 come from the developing world, chiefly China and India, which between them account for half of all new emissions. And so the idea that the West, even if we were to stop emitting altogether, that would not make any difference to the rate at which the world continues to warm. It will warm, but slowly, gently, and beneficially. So the idea that we should go on trashing our economies for the sake of achieving no climatic change, the only change we'll do is to wreck our economies, do our workers out of jobs, push our manufacturing industries over to India, Russia, and China. That is not a sensible policy in the long term. All that is really going to be achieved, if this climate nonsense continues any longer, is the destruction and laying waste of the economies of the West. And I, as a Westerner, don't want that.
Well, if one didn't know any better, you might think that was the whole point. James Taylor, I think, wants to jump in here.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Paris Climate Accord doesn't put much, if anything, for restrictions, certainly no restrictions, but even for these goals that would need to be met by China, India, et cetera. China says, they said then that, well, we will aim to reach our peak around 2030, and then after that we won't, our aim is to not go any higher. We hear about India in 2070, but I mean, not only does that, China is making a point, as is India, to develop as much conventional energy, and especially coal, as possible right now, so that they can make that peak as high as possible, so that then it doesn't impede their economic development at all. By the way, I don't hold that against them, but if you believe in a climate crisis and think that we all need to do this together, and the United States needs to lead by example or lead through diplomacy, it's failing. But as much as that really is very little of an imposition on China and India, you see it at this COP meeting here in Glasgow, how little even that is worth. China and India, no, we don't want to talk to you. All of a sudden, they're not interested in discussions. What's going to happen? Mark my words. Since when has China upheld their international agreements? Since when have they been a trustworthy partner in negotiations? Come 2030, they're going to say, well, you didn't put as much money into the climate reparations fund as we envisioned in Paris. You didn't reduce the full amount that you had aimed to do so. So we're not bound by any of this. Screw you. And, you can come back to us when you've given us more money and cut more of your own economy. Then we'll talk. That's what's going to happen. One other point, just if I can. When Craig mentioned about how at the COP facility, folks, not social distancing, not wearing the mask, despite the rules that require folks to do so. It's real interesting. A year and a half ago, when COVID first became an issue, and the left, the political left, and especially the climate left, tried to tar climate realists with the notion that, hey, do you ever notice it's the same folks that are questioning mask mandates and social distancing, et cetera, that are climate deniers? Well, I'm happy that they make that connection, because their own words and actions work against their own messaging. They put in place these restrictions for the world, for everyone to see, we have social distancing, mask mandates, and the very people who are the most adamant about these social distancing requirements and masks are the same folks who are so adamant about carbon dioxide emissions. They are hypocrites when they come here to the United Nations meeting. They don't wear their masks. They don't social distance. Here in the hotel that we're holding our conference at, you go right outside the door at the bar, everyone's sitting around talking. They're not putting their mask on between bites. They know that it doesn't matter, that the masks don't do much, that the social distancing doesn't do much, if anything at all. And it's the same thing with carbon dioxide emissions. You are hypocrites. That's why you lost the election last night in Virginia, why you almost lost in New Jersey when you should have won by about 30 points. It's New Jersey. People get it. You guys don't believe the garbage you're peddling.
All right. That's a great way to finish. That's great. Actually, I saw Christian Amanpour actually was questioning Boris Johnson, and asked him, why were you not wearing a mask next to national treasure and 95-year-old David Attenborough? Because you were basically are you trying to kill him, this national treasure? But his answer was like, come on, I felt you make these kind of judgments. You feel like I was far enough away from him. And it's like, well, I'd like to make my own judgment too, like we've made today, whether we have masks on, and we have not had them in this room because we are free and we make our own decisions. So actually, one of the things that I saw mentioned, and it's I was gobsmacked by it, the concern over the deforestation of Brazil. Now, and then extrapolating that, saying that the forest is, or the globe is becoming deforested. But I know from listening to many of you on this panel, but especially James Taylor, he makes this presentation all the time, the Earth is getting greener. The Sahara is actually smaller in size than it was 30, 50 years ago, certainly 100 years ago. And I think this gets to the point that you were making, Christopher, is that there seems to be a desire to stop economic progress. And then so the West has to come back, and they're not even going to let the developing world actually even come up very far. We all have to come down to this crummy middle. But the reason the forest is being destroyed or deforested in places in Brazil is because they're trying to improve their lives. They don't want to live in a jungle anymore. They want to grow crops. They want to build cities, and there just seems to be this. To me, the theme of all these COPs is economic misery. It's the desire that right now the world is perfect and it can never change. And in fact, it was probably better 100 years ago. So let's go backwards. There doesn't seem to be any real sense that we are on this earth to live our lives and to prosper. But any attempts to prosper by human beings is considered evil.
Every totalitarian movement, whether it be fascism, Marxism, the blend of fascism and Marxism that you now have in Russia and China, Islamism, it might have been Puritanism in religion, it's always Puritan. It always wants to make life miserable for everybody. This is a common feature of all totalitarian regimes. It always has been, and one suspects it always will be. This is particularly appealing to young people who think it's a great idea that everything should become more miserable, provided they can attach some apparently holy purpose to it. And that's why this climate thing is so useful, because anyone who has studied this for more than about 5 minutes realizes that whatever we do is going to make hardly any difference to the climate. But to pick up on this point about deforestation, which was the main purpose of your question, yes, there has been a lot of unnecessary and unwise deforestation in Brazil, because although, of course, they want to clear the forest in order to grow crops, they find that by clearing the forest, you get, after a few years, less yield in usable food from the fields than you would have got just by picking the nuts and berries and leaving the trees there in the first place. So it hasn't been a success, the deforestation in Brazil. A lot of it's happened without the knowledge of and contrary to the policy of the Brazilian government. And so it would be sensible from the point of view of Brazilian agriculture if there were less of that kind of unplanned and unwanted and ultimately self-defeating deforestation. So the overall effect, however, of the extra CO2 in the atmosphere, because CO2 is plant food, it's an essential ingredient together with water and oxygen and sunlight in photosynthesis, that turns the carbon dioxide in the air into the carbon in the trunks of the trees and in the leaves of the plants. So it's an essential for all life on Earth, and because the carbon dioxide concentration has increased, and increased quite a bit, by about 50% compared with what it was before the Industrial Revolution, the trees and plants are really enjoying this. And my lovely wife runs rather a large garden on our little estate down in Gloucestershire, and everything grows at a furious rate thanks to the CO2 fertilization, as it is called. So the greening of the planet has been visible all the way around the world. You can see it from space. NASA has published a series of papers attesting to this. And to pick up the point about the greening of the Sahara, as far back as 1981, Nicholson et al. Reported that even at that stage, the Sahara had shrunk by 300,000 square kilometers, thanks to greening of areas of the Sahara that had not been inhabited in living memory because they'd become too dry. But you're too young to remember this, but if you go back 7,000 years, then the whole of what is now the northern Sahara was in fact green. And then suddenly, because of all those pre-industrial SUVs that they were driving around it all became desertificated. So frankly, the trouble with a lot of this is that people don't look at the history. They think that every climate change that happens now has never happened before and it's all because of us. If they knew just a little bit of the geological, historical context, they wouldn't worry any more than you or I do.
Very good. Yes. Go ahead, Mark. I have a question for you and Harry too after this. Go ahead.
Okay, I was just saying on the deforestation, I did a documentary in 2000 on Amazon rainforest, clear-cutting the myths. So one of the key things about understand is they would, in the 1990s, before climate change actually caught on, that was the big issue. Hollywood movies, Disney films, National Geographic, Sting's rainforest concert in New York City every year for the rainforest, Save the Rainforest campaign. It turns out it was one of the most intact forests on the planet, still is, more than 90% intact. And all the estimates of how many football fields a minute didn't account for regeneration. And Christopher's right. If they try to do agriculture, it's generally very difficult because the land loses fertility over time. However, what's happened is as countries are allowed to develop, and I say allowed, meaning they're not having green restrictions on them for economic growth, the people are leaving the jungle, moving into the urban and suburban areas and cities, leaving them. And so what's happened, and even the New York Times in 2005 acknowledged for every acre cut in the Amazon, 50 are being regenerated. There's new forestry techniques now where they do, you can call it sustainable forestry, but within 7 years you can't distinguish the plant and animal species because of the way they cut. They don't just clear whole areas. So there's a lot of hopeful news on the Amazon. And interesting enough, when Bolsonaro became the head of Brazil, the media went nuts after him for deforestation and fire rates that were much actually lower than even had been in 10 years, but they were just trying to hype it, sort of going after him the way they go after Trump. But the Amazon rainforest was another one of those stories that never added up when you looked at the science. And I remember talking to environmentalists in Brazil, slamming the guidebooks down as they told people, come see the Amazon, it's about to disappear for all time. It was just nonsense. It's almost 2/3 the size of the United States.
All right. Well, Harry, did you have anything to add to that?
I think
quickly?
Harry had something.
Thank you. Yes, I think an important point here is it's a sort of neocolonialist enterprise for us in the West to be telling countries like Brazil to actually how they use their resources. Now, while I do think there's important reasons to protect the rainforest, and there's hopeful news on forestry around the world because of the CO2 effect and for other reasons as well, it just isn't for us to be telling other countries how they use their resources. And we've got into this mindset now where we tell poor countries which fuels they can use, and that will have devastating impacts for the poorest people in the world who need to industrialize, they need to develop, and it's for them to decide how they use their resources. It's not for us to decide.
Yep. Very good, very good. In fact, that's a great segue to I have 2 more questions in the 10 minutes I think we have left here. And it's dealing with energy, which is a big topic of conversation here. And it's broken up into 2 parts in my mind. Energy that works and energy plans that won't work. And so let's get to the energy that works first. Big oil, right? They're always the villain. They've spent the last decade plus funding outfits like the Sierra Club and touting their green energy initiatives. Even some saying that we're going to get out of the fossil fuel business altogether. I mean, my favorite was from, I guess, maybe at least 15 years ago. BP here in the UK changed their slogan to Beyond Petroleum. They're a petroleum company. That's like, it's like McDonald's saying Beyond Food, not even Beyond Hamburgers, and doing something else. What's going on here actually is, and actually some of the questions in our chat here talked about why aren't fossil fuels companies actually talking about the benefits to the world and to lifespan and to life among humans because of their product. And why isn't Saudi Arabia actually, instead of not being here, setting up an outfit like across the street, touting the benefits of fossil fuels? Because here, fossil fuel is evil. It's an enemy. And so our viewers today were asking, why isn't the fossil fuel industry, frankly, standing up for itself for all the good they've done in the world?
I can give you some history on that.
I bet you could.
The World Coal Council used to do exactly what you're saying and what kind audience are also saying, standing up for their own product. And they did that. They had a very good website, which used to have a lot of information, particularly about how valuable coal-fired power is in developing countries. Because if you're a developing country, you're not going to find it too easy, technically speaking, to manage a nuclear power station. And it's no good having wind and solar because you can't afford it. And so what you want is the cheapest form of electricity because you don't have a lot of money. And you want to be able to maintain it, and it wants to be reliable. It's got to be dispatchable, which means you've got to have continuous baseload power available at all times. And the only way to do that, if you're a third world country, is to have coal-fired power. But the relentless propaganda from the far left, who are driving this climate rubbish, was so intense that in the end, all but one of the members of the World Coal Council, about 6 or 7 years ago now, decided that they would no longer fight for their own industry. And the one that continued to fight for it left the World Coal Council. Same thing has happened with many of the oil and gas companies. They've just decided, for commercial reasons apart from anything else, that they can't go on fighting. There's so many people have been fooled by this global warming gibberish that they feared that if they didn't toe the line, then they would be subjected to every kind of lawsuit, and of course that is happening. And when you have increasingly stupid judges, often for political reasons, siding with the extremists, even though the evidence is plainly in the other direction, it is very difficult for them. However, I think we should say, on behalf of our audience here, to the coal and oil and gas companies, let's not call them fossil fuels, let's call them what they are, coal and oil and gas. For heaven's sake, get on with defending and arguing for your own industries. Do not be ashamed. There was a time, for instance, in this country when I was a lad, when coal-fired power was killing 37,000 people a year just in this country through polluting the air. So why did we go on burning coal with that rate of death? Because the benefits of having coal-fired power far outweighed that actually quite large death toll. But of course the coal-fired power didn't just sit there and go on killing people. A friend of mine at Cambridge developed the fluidized bed combustion combined with high temperature. That means you don't get the pollutants that kill people, you just get lots and lots of power and no pollutants. So it can be done and should be done. Just don't wimp out, you wretched coal, oil and gas companies. Stand to defend your industry, because your industry has provided far more benefits to the world than it has ever provided harm. And don't you forget it.
Well said. I know in the past the industry did in fact take a skeptical view. We worked with some of them a long time ago where they were actually on the side of trying to challenge the Greens. They took a strategic turn over almost 2 decades ago, and in fact started to embrace the Greens. I know from our organization, we're accused all the time of receiving big oil money or money from the fossil. We receive none of that, all right? And in fact, the other side, we have evidence that they fund up the wazoo, and you wonder why would that be? Well, the reason is, and this is what is told, is that they want to get in good standing, as Christopher said, with the public. And a lot of this came from Europe and the way that they handled it. So they took a strategic interest in trying to make themselves, beyond petroleum, make Exxon kind of like a forward-thinking company, thinking that this would, feed the crocodile, as Winston Churchill said, hoping that it will eat them last. Interestingly, I was just at a shareholder meeting. One of the things we try to do, and I know Heartland does too, is to keep these corporations accountable. We buy shares and actually attend their meetings. And I was at one during the Exxon meeting this year where I think it was 2 of their major boards of directors people were replaced by active Greens. This despite and these are people who actually put forward a resolution for the company to actually phase out the very product it was making ultimately, and it passed. So they fed the crocodile and it ate them. And now it's going on, and it's still, when I speak to some of these associations, I get invited from time to time to just give an address and that. they're clueless that they are at war. It's almost like the old movie Independence Day. You know, what can we do to appease you? Die, was what the alien said. And that's where they're at. They don't get it. And they still believe, because they want to get good, what they call ESG scores, environmental social governance scores for their shareholders, that if they do certain things, that'll crank up their standing, kind of like a Better Business Bureau standing with the Greens, and that'll make their product more, attractive. And it doesn't, and they're going to be soaked for this, and a lot of them are going to have a rude awakening one day when they're run out of business.
Yeah, a couple other points. Those are great points made by Christopher and Craig. Regarding coal versus natural gas, the natural gas industry for a long time funded environmental activist groups, and to some extent still do. But their rationale was, well, if the public believes there's a climate crisis, and if legislators impose restrictions on carbon dioxide, well, coal is used to fire up electricity, to produce electricity. Natural gas, which these oil companies also produce, ExxonMobil or Shell or BP or whatever else, I hate to name specific companies, but it's just the industry as a whole, they produce natural gas as well as oil. And the thought process was, well, yeah, we're going to support, and they still do support, carbon dioxide restrictions or taxes or cap and trade or whatever, because it is driving out a competitor, and they believe therefore they will benefit. If coal is taken out of the electricity mix, their bet is that natural gas will be added. What they didn't see, talking about feeding the crocodile, is they were off the menu for a very brief period of time while they were funding these groups, and it didn't take those groups long to put them on the menu, regardless of how much funding they were getting. Regarding the coal industry, back, must have been a decade ago, I remember giving a talk to executives within the coal industry, and they wanted to learn about our take on global warming. And at the end of my talk, I received compliments from quite a few of the people there, except uniformly they took issue with me when I was talking about what the future should be and how coal needs to be a staple of our energy future. And these are executives at a coal company and coal companies. And they said, well, we agree with everything you said. It was fantastic. Although, I think you need to leave a little wiggle room. It's okay to phase out coal so long as you socialize the costs. In other words, pay us enough money, we'll go away, buy out our company, buy out our industry, give us a friendly takeover. And it tells you what it's all about. It's all about profit. The natural gas and oil companies, they are going to support carbon dioxide restrictions because they think they can profit by it. I think they're wrong, but they think so. Even the coal industry thought they could profit if they did it right.
All right, I want to wrap up here on the other side of the equation, and maybe I don't want to bring the microphone down here. Skip Moncton for a minute. There we go. So we get these guys in the game. All right. So the other side of that, of course, is what I call the energy that doesn't work, right? So here at COP26, I think giving them the best benefit of the doubt, they would like to go all electric, right? And so they want, but they don't want to use nuclear. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that we could use solar and wind and get all the energy we need to charge up all these batteries that we need, so that so the internal combustion engine isn't necessary anymore, except for maybe airplanes and stuff like that. You'd only use fossil fuels for that. But basically, the electrification of the world seems to be a goal that a layman can understand. That's what they want. Again, granting them their best intentions. Why? And if this is a climate conference, and this is something, and they're actually concerned, and they say this a lot, they're concerned about the poorest people in the world. How come there is not a single discussion, and if there was and I missed it, I apologize, about the rare earth minerals that need to be pulled out of the earth in order to create all of these batteries? Even if we were able to increase the battery capacity to hold energy, a battery's capacity 100-fold, which isn't going to happen, but that's what would be kind of necessary to make it somewhat feasible on a grand scale like this. But let's just say even that was possible. You still have to get those minerals out of the earth. It is one of the dirtiest industries in the world, much dirtier than fracking, by the way, to work on prospective energy solutions. And there isn't a single person here, I don't think, that's talked about the child labor in the Congo, of getting cobalt out of the ground, of the child labor really all over the world. And it seems to me, I'll get off my soapbox in 10 seconds. It seems to me that we have a lot of wealthy people here in Glasgow who are very fine having the poorest people in the world do horrible backbreaking labor so that they can feel good about themselves by driving a Tesla. So why isn't this conference, of all places, this should be the place you talk about those issues, and I guarantee there hasn't been a syllable talked about. React.
Well, I think I have the solution. Let's apply the environment, social governance, and the Chinese social credit score to the solar and renewable energy industry. Can you imagine how they would fail across the board? Are they meeting human rights records? Are they meeting environmental standards? What we've done with solar and wind, again, global U.S. energy production, solar and wind, barely 4% combined energy. They want to expand this and the electrification of our entire, country and globe at some point. And what it's done is it's made us more reliant on China. 90% of solar panels we buy are from China. We have a huge problem with windmills and solar panel in terms of recycling. One of the people who actually laid this out beautifully was Michael Moore in his film, what was it? Not Apocalypse. What was the name? Planet of the Humans. Yes. And for his trouble, Michael Moore was exiled from Planet of the Progressives as they all went after him. I mean, he literally went after all the solar and wind power. But this is where the insanity comes. You'll have people shutting down Europe in American mining, energy, exploration, drilling, and all it means is one thing. CO2 emissions will rise even faster because we're going to end up outsourcing it to countries with lower environmental standards, not to mention human rights records. And that's the whole problem with this whole entire green agenda. They don't actually apply anything of logic or anything else. And so I think what we're going to face now is with the coming in Europe and coming in the United States, the energy crisis, shortages, high prices, people choosing between heating and eating, it's all going to come to a head. And even though the New York Times is worried people are going to blame it on the solar, and even though Bloomberg says that's what it is, I think the official media narrative is going to be, I think what Slate magazine is saying. They're doubling down and saying fossil fuels are the problem for the global energy crisis. And I think the only logic thing they're trying to say, their logic is essentially that had we gone renewable years ago, we could have gone through this bumpy transition and we would have been all living in our utopia now. But because of us evil deniers, we delayed it. So now it's going to be an even bumpier transition to this utopian of solar and wind.
Thank you. Yeah, well, Britain is actually a great example of what not to do. We're running an experiment in using this new wind and solar technology. And actually yesterday, on the day of COP conference, we actually hit a new record, and the record was the most money we've ever spent balancing the grid. So that's when we have to get all these backup sources of power, and that included coal. We've made a big deal of saying we've moved on from coal, but we keep needing to bring it back because there's just not enough wind and solar at certain points. So the wind energy collapsed. We needed to fire up these power stations, and we spent something like £44 million yesterday just on backing up the grid, and that's a new record. So we can see in real time at this conference that wind and solar aren't working. The percentage of fossil fuels in the global energy mix has been over 80%, just over 80% for decades, and that number has barely changed at all, despite trillions of investment in renewables. And of course, those human rights concerns are appalling. These are scenes of the most harsh cruelty, and the renewables industry needs to be subject to just as much scrutiny as any other business.
Well, they get it at the Climate Reality Forum. Let's move that microphone down so that James can wrap up here in a few minutes.
Can I very quickly say, as the microphone passes in front of me, every time you add wind and solar to a grid, you add CO2 emissions to the grid. It does not, repeat not, reduce CO2 emissions. The grid as a whole will emit more CO2 the more wind and solar you add, because you have to maintain spinning reserve. That's the point that Harry has just pointed out. And in order to maintain spinning reserve, so you've got enough backup when the wind and solar aren't doing enough, then you have to bring it online, but you have to keep it online all the time, very inefficiently, emitting very much larger amounts of CO2 than if it was running at full chat. So the whole thing is utterly stupid. Every policy that they are advocating to decarbonize the grid is actually increasing the carbon dioxide output of the grid. It is as insane as that.
And there isn't a single steel mill that runs on solar power in the world either, so that makes those things.
All right. Well, just to wrap up, thank you, men, women, children of all ages, for being here over the last couple of days. We're presenting information. The Heartland Institute and our friends and allies last month at the 14th International Conference on Climate Change here in Glasgow at our Climate Reality Forum. Next week, we will be in Gera, Germany, partnering with the European Institute for Climate and Energy with another climate conference really focused on European issues and European science, economic, and policy experts. That one I don't believe will be live streamed, but videos of the presentations are usually made available soon thereafter. They're always made available soon thereafter. The fact of the matter is what we have here is basically you have on the one hand, you have these climate hypocrites that are, prancing around in Glasgow saying the things that they think people want to hear. Joe Biden flies here. He stays here for 48 hours at the most, as do other world leaders, and they leave. They leave because they're not here to talk about how to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. There's no need to do so, but even if they think there is a reason to do so, if you're going to stay 48 hours and leave, why did you spread your CO2 plague by flying here and flying back and accomplishing nothing? It's all grandstanding. That's the reason why that's the reason why that particular mindset is the reason why we saw the election results we saw yesterday in the United States. It's the reason why just one short year from now, a lot of these hypocrites are going to be thrown out on the streets. And the beauty of this is, as much as they would love to keep us down using climate change as a reason to do so, they have accomplished little legislatively. All they've been able to accomplish is by executive order, which can be reversed. We're fighting an uphill battle with the media. Sometimes we're fighting an uphill battle with policymakers. But the fact of the matter is they are frustrated beyond belief that they have not gotten us under their thumb. Us being the American people, free citizens around the world. Don't give up the fight, because in that regard, ask your climate activist groups. Ask who's winning. They'll say we're winning. We're winning on the science. They won't say that, but we are. We're winning in public opinion. And we're winning regarding policymakers. They have not been able to do what they achieved. Folks, that's due to you. That's due to your voices being made. When policymakers understand that voters and the grassroots will not allow them to get away with all of these over-the-top measures that are being proposed here, well, those policymakers, those politicians are going to shy away from implementing those policies, and that's exactly what's happened. So let them prance, let them preen, let Joe Biden come here, fall asleep for a while, and then go back home. The fact of the matter is, with your help, with the help of all these fantastic groups that we partner with at the Heartland Institute that we're so happy to work with, we will continue winning. So thank you very much. We look forward to seeing some of you in Germany next week, and just keep the faith. Thank you so much. See you next time.